Welcome to the next e-CENS video to reveal why switching from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4 requires time and resources. Hi, I'm Holger Tempel, partner at e-CENS as well as the founder and managing director of e-CENS in Germany. In the last video, I've shed some light on the migration phases when you want to switch from Universal Analytics to GA4. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the metric users, its characteristics, and the differences and limitations that come along with it when using Universal Analytics or GA4. That being said, let's start with looking at the details of this particular metric. You surely have come across the metric called user, no matter if you are looking at reports in Universal Analytics or GA4. But what are the characteristics of this metric and how are users counted? To answer this, let's have a closer look. And one thing we need to clarify upfront is the myth about the metric's meaning. So when we talk about users in Google Analytics, no matter if it's in Universal Analytics or GA4, we mean an individual. Now let's assume that this individual uses a desktop PC and opens a Microsoft Edge browser to visit a website. This would then result in one user being counted in Google Analytics. But this will change once the user visits the same site from the PC with different browsers. For Google Analytics, this is now to be counted as 2 additional users, which makes our individual now to become 3 users in Google Analytics. And since many users also have a smartphone and a tablet, it is also very likely that this user might use these devices to visit the website. In addition, it's also possible that he uses different browsers on each device. And once he visits the website, the number of users in Google Analytics will increase to 7. This behavior leads to the conclusion that a user in Google Analytics, Universal Analytics, and GA4 is nothing more but a browser instance. There's only one exception, which I'll cover in a moment. So when it comes to the metric users in Universal Analytics, you now know that the metric's meaning is browser instance. You remember that I've mentioned an exception from that? And that is when the users are being tracked with user ID. Tracking users with user ID means that the users will log into your website at some point during their visit, and your website, for instance an online shop, is able to issue a unique ID to the logged-in user. Then this ID can be used to recognize a user and thus distinguish him from a browser instance. A problem in Universal Analytics with regards to users is that any user is counted as a user. So this metric also contains users which left a website's page right after they landed there. And even though this behavior is counted as a bounce, it is also counted towards the user metrics in Universal Analytics, what after all makes the metric's reliability suffer and somewhat blurs its meaning. In GA4, the user metric also means browser instance. And the same exception regarding user ID applies here too. In addition, GA4 also offers the possibility to identify or re-identify a user with Google Signals. This is done for users who sign into Google with their Google account and have consented to share this information. Said that, please clarify with your DPO if activating and using Google Signals might cause problems regarding data privacy regulations. GA4 comes along with 2 types of users: total users, which is the equivalent to users in Universal Analytics, and active users, which only counts users with at least 1 engaged session or when Analytics collects the first visit event or engagement time millisecond parameter from a website, the first open event or the engagement time millisecond parameter from an Android app, or the first open event or user engagement event from an iOS app. Before we dive deeper into what the impact is regarding data collection, let's look at how Google Analytics deals with the metric users when the tracking code gets involved. So let's check first what happens if a user visits a website with different devices. Coming back to our example, let's assume that the user visits the website during his lunch break with a PC. After work, while sitting in the subway on his way home, he visits the website again with his smartphone. And later in the evening, he uses his tablet to access the site once more. So what happens each time the user visits the website is that the integrated tracking code will assign the so-called client ID to each browser instance on each device. And these client IDs are sent to Google Analytics by the tracking code with each hit or event. Obviously, all client IDs differ, and this is how Google Analytics will distinguish between the browser instances. So what is this client ID made of? Basically, it consists of two parts. The first part is a random value, while the second part represents the timestamp of the first session in Unix epoch time, which is seconds since 1st January of 1970. You can use an online tool like unixtimestamp.com to convert the number of seconds into a human-readable date and time format. In this case, the first session was on Friday, 25th March 2022 at 23 minutes and 11 seconds past 8 p.m. So if you're now asking, where do I find this client ID? The answer is pretty simple. Just use a tool like the Chrome extension WASP, which will provide you with some quite detailed information for both Universal Analytics and GA4. Now that you know the basics about client ID, you now also know why a user visiting a website with 3 different devices or browsers will result in 3 users and 3 devices in Universal Analytics as well as in GA4. So as a recap, you remember from the slide about client ID that when a user visits a website with 3 different devices or browsers, these browser instances will be assigned a client ID by the tracking code, which will then be sent to Google Analytics in conjunction with a hit in Universal Analytics or an event in GA4. Now, to be able to analyze an individual's behavior across different devices and different browsers as well, the website needs to provide a login. Also, the website should be able to issue a unique ID for the logged-in user. This unique ID can then be used as the user ID to be assigned to each browser instance and can be sent to Google Analytics in conjunction with a client ID and a hit to Universal Analytics or an event to GA4. If you're not sure about how to issue unique IDs and how to send them as user IDs to Google Analytics, you can always turn to us at e-CENS. And if the question now arises where to find this user ID, it can also easily be answered by using the previously mentioned tool WASP, which will again show detailed information for both Universal Analytics and GA4. Obviously, the information about user ID is to be found right below the client ID. Now that you know the basics about user ID, it makes perfect sense that a logged-in user browsing a website with 3 different devices will result in 1 user and 3 devices in Universal Analytics as well as in GA4. In addition, issuing a unique ID and using it as a user ID also enables Google Analytics to recognize the user across devices. And this feature is called cross-device tracking, which is available for both Universal Analytics and GA4. So now that we know about the user ID and the capability of cross-device tracking, what about cross-platform tracking? You might now ask, what's cross-platform tracking and what's the difference? In a nutshell, cross-platform tracking means that a user visits the website of a brand with a desktop PC's browser, but also uses the brand's app on a smartphone and tablet. So we are talking about 2 platforms, app and web. In this particular scenario, the tracking code implemented in the website will send data to Universal Analytics together with a client ID, which will result in 1 user and 1 device. And since Mobile SDK has been discontinued back in 2018, app data cannot be collected and analyzed with Universal Analytics anymore, which on the other hand is doable with GA4. But since both app and web in this scenario are sending the client ID along with an event, this will also result in 3 users and 3 devices because GA4 cannot recognize the user. But if both app and web offer a login and therefore can issue a unique ID, which can be used as a user ID, then GA4 is able to recognize the user. In this scenario, it will result in GA4 counting 1 user and 3 devices. And this is, after all, the big advantage of GA4 compared to Universal Analytics, because GA4 enables you to recognize and track your users across devices and across platforms. I hope this video was helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one. And always keep in mind, experience cannot be learned, it must be gathered. Therefore, rely on the experts' experience only.